Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our very first webinar on behalf of London Stock Exchange Group and their Risk Intelligence and Child Identity Protection. We'd like to welcome you all to this very first webinar on child identity theft. It's a very important topic, still not well known, and in terms of what is it? What are the implications? What are the consequences? How can we prevent it? What are some of the responses to it? And I think that we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today that will help us unpack those issues. If you would like to, please do have, if you have any questions, please write them in the question and answer section where you'll be able to write your question. Please write if the question is to Renata, our first speaker, or if it's to Basca, UNICEF, whoever it is you're directing your question to. Some of these questions we can answer during the webinar, but others we'll leave till the very end. So what we will do today is we'll have our very first speaker, Renata first, who will be speaking about the voices of victims across the world as one herself. And then we'll move on to Ruth Elena Alves da Mota, who will speak about the role of financial institutions. Then Bhaskar Mishra from UNICEF, who is the international lead from UNICEF working on all things related to children's identities. Then we'll finalize the webinar with Darren McCormack, who is working on the law enforcement response from Department of DHS, and he will look at solutions and how to prevent this practice. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to you, Renata, to speak about your experience in this field. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you so much, Mia. Just checking that everyone can hear me well.
Yep, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for everyone that took time out of your day to listen to this important issue. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for everyone that made themselves available. So I would like to tell you just a little bit about my personal story, and then I'll move on to the overall victim voices. So my name is Renata First. I was born in Brazil in the 90s, and I a very happy childhood overall, but it was also full of mysteries. I grew up receiving letters in my house that were addressed to me. When I started to read, I could already identify that the letters had my name on it. And I would ask my mom, she was a single mom raising me and my sister by herself, and she would say, "Sorry about it, you're not going to understand, it's adult things." But I was a little girl, so I would always imagine that it was a prince writing to me, and I would create fantasies in my head. And sometimes I would open the letters, see what it was about, find only a bunch of numbers and words that I couldn't understand, like violation, final notice, debt, and that didn't mean much to me. At some point, a few times, we had men coming to my house and knocking on the door and asking if Renata was there, and I would come. And yes, that's me. And they will always be shocked and ask to speak with my parents. But it happened 2 times that they came in to the house and they took things like the couch and the TV. And it was just things that I couldn't make sense at the time, but now as an adult, I know that those were government officials looking for things that they could take to contribute towards a payment of a debt that it was in my name. I found out everything that was happening when I was 12 years old, and I started to notice that maybe that wasn't normal. And I asked all my friends at my school that day if they received letters in their name, if they had men coming to their house and asking for them, and everyone confirmed that that was not their reality. And that's the day that I found out that was not normal. So I went home that day and I spoke with my mom, and that's the day that she told me everything the best you can for a 12-year-old child. And what she told me was that when I was 6 years old, a family member took my CPF, that's the document ID in Brazil. In the United States, it would be like the social security number. So that person used my identity and opened businesses, two different companies. It was a pizzeria and a ceramic shop. And the reason that they did that is because they couldn't operate under their own name. Because they already had a lot of debt in their name. And so they needed a clean identity. So they used mine. They opened two companies. Those companies were operational for 2 years and then they failed. That person disappeared from Brazil. And so there was a lot of debt that needed to be paid for the government on taxes and different, there were also lawsuits against those companies. And then they were looking for the owner, and the owner on paper was 6-year-old me, 8-year-old me. The first court case against those companies that had my name on it, I was 10 years old. And the system couldn't see that I was a child. They didn't check for age. They just saw a number and an identity number. So I grew up with problems. My mom tried to resolve the best she could. She went to the Child Protective Services, everything, and no one knew how to help us. So when I turned 18, I started to feel the consequences very personally. I had my first job. I was working an internship. And then one day, all my assets were frozen in my bank accounts, and everything was taken to contribute towards the payment of this debt. And I remember going to the bank and saying, the day all of this happened in the 90s, I was just a child, it was me. And the answer was always, there's nothing we can do. It's a court order, is your name in your ID. So we need to take the money more than once, more than 2 times my money, my bank account was frozen to contribute towards the payment of this debt that was done in my name when I was a child. It was never my fault. And that ended up with the decision to try in court, and there were no precedents in Brazil to help cases like mine. I made the decision to not have anything in my name. And that meant that I became a financial ghost. I couldn't have anything in my name because otherwise I would take it. I was not going to pay towards a debt that was never mine. I couldn't have a normal life. So I didn't have bank accounts. I would use other people's bank accounts. And that put me in a position where I couldn't have financial freedom. I didn't have the rights to my identity. I couldn't exist in the system. Otherwise, I would be a victim. So life took me to South Africa, where I was able to have a normal life. Long story short, I was able to my name when I was 28 years old. So 2 decades later, and the only reason that happened was because my mom worked 3-4 jobs to pay everything that it was in my name, even though it wasn't her fault either. But she did that to help me. And so I now I have a clean name. In Brazil, they literally use the word, you have a dirty name when you have that. And to hear that when I was 12 had severe emotional consequences for me. I was severely depressed when I found everything out. I didn't want to live because it's that feeling of what's the point of even starting if I already have a dirty name according to the system. And then I started in the fighting financial crime industry, working with financial institutions, and then I decided to come forward with my story this year. And I can tell you, since I started talking about it, the documentary about my story was released in July. It was nominated to Oscar qualifying film festivals, which was amazing to see, just the recognition. And since then, I had over 150 victims reaching out to me personally to share that the same happened to them. And those were victims across the United States, Brazil, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. So it showed me that it is an issue that it goes beyond Brazil. I know that I'm not alone. We have statistics in certain countries like the United States. In the US, we know that 1 in 50 fall victims to identity theft, and 73% of the cases is done by a family member, someone that is known to the victim. So it is a type of financial abuse that is extremely underreported and not discussed. And that's because the majority of the times it happened inside the home. When this happened to me, I had no digital footprints. There were no internet. There was no social media. So the only people that had access to my identity were my family members. And that holds true to this day. We know that the majority of the times it's parents that are already in financial distress themselves, family members that can no longer operate in their own name. And so they look at the children of the family to be able to have a clean credit. Since talking about my story, I heard many, many victim stories, many, from small debts like car loans and utility bills, all the way to not being able to go to college because college loans were denied due to a very bad credit of a history that were done in their childhood, all the way to 10 million in debt done in the child's name. And one thing that I never thought it could be true is someone being criminally responsible for something done in their name when they were a child. But 2 cases already came to me of victims that exactly that happened in Brazil. And I'm just going to very briefly tell this story. A 15-year-old boy, the family used his identity to open a company because the adults of the family all already had ruined their credit, so they could no longer operate in their name. When the boy was about to turn 18, they realized that this is going to become an issue. He's not going to be able to have a normal life. So when he was 18, the family took his name out of the company and liquidated the company, so ended the company. He was already 18 at the time. He had no idea that all of this was happening. And that was considered tax evasion by the Brazilian authorities, and he was charged with tax evasion. He told his story in the criminal court, and the judge said, I agree with you. You're a victim. I'm so sorry, but I have no precedent to see that way. It was your name there. So he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for tax evasion for something that was done in his name when he was a child, a 15-year-old boy, decisions that were made on his behalf. The judge really felt sorry for his situation. And even though there was no precedence, that was his, but he ordered that he would not, he didn't have to go to prison. But that is in his criminal record, and that led to him to not be able to have normal jobs, a normal life. It kept him aside from society, and that's the story that I keep hearing from victims. I have to be a ghost in the system. I can't have my name. And the other thing is, depending on the country, you have different typologies. So in Brazil, it's not considered child identity theft. In the US, it is. But the one thing that it is in common is the lack of a very good system that can remediate without putting all responsibility in the victim. And that's the thing that is very common in all the systems. And I keep hearing from the victims is, you are guilty until you can prove you are not. And so you turn 18, you have all this debt, and then it's up to you to go to every creditor to ask for help and to go against your family. That's the one thing we keep hearing. You have to open a case, you have against your family. That's easier said than done, has extremely difficult emotional consequences. And victims are left with not being able to know where to go for help. And I'll just finish by saying that I heard so much from so many victims. We together, especially in Brazil, and we created a group. It's called Criança Sem Dívida. So the translation is Child Without Debt. We have an Instagram page. We're advocating, we're creating content. We got the Senate attention in Brazil for a potential law reform, but that's still initial stages. There is still a lot that needs to be done. But I just want to use this opportunity to share my story. The United Nations, organizations like Child Identity Protection and UNICEF in an extremely important position to help victims like I was one day, to help the voiceless really and make sure that every child has the right to their identity. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Renata. I'm very sorry that this has happened to you and to all the other thousands of children, but I am thankful that you're brave enough to speak up so that we can raise awareness about this, and we will do that and we'll continue to do that. But over to you now, Ruth Helena Alves da Mota, who also works for LSEG and the Risk Intelligence Group, to talk about what is the role of financial institutions in child identity theft. How can they prevent it, and what are their responses that they can have? I will be adding, I've added Renata's bio in the chat function, and I'll also be adding Ruth's. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much, Mia. It's a pleasure to be here and join Renata in bringing awareness to such an important topic. So as Renata mentioned, in most cases of child identity theft, there is a participation from a family member. That is 73% of the time there is involvement of a family member. So this is really a situation of abuse, of financial abuse, emotional abuse, and everything that Renata has already spoken about. So children are left vulnerable to look after their financial health, their financial life, and the financial industry plays a key role in protecting children in this situation. There are red flags that financial institutions can identify when it comes to child identity theft. For once, children do not really need credit, right? They will need credit as they grow up as adults, and we need to have a financial life. We need to make purchases. We need to have a credit to their name to buy a house, get a loan, etc. The minute that you, as a financial institution, identify that credit request is coming from a minor, you should have your eyes wide open. But the only way that you can do that is if you are verifying that that customer is a child. And you cannot do that without age verification and identity verification to ensure that that customer is really of age, of legal age, to be making those financial decisions. So the financial industry plays a key role here to help protect the future, financial future of children and this financial exploitation. There's also the issue of identity theft with synthetic identity fraud. That is when criminals will pick up pieces of personal identifying information with fake identifying information and create a new identity. And children are most of the time, 40% of these victims of this type of crime are children. And parents also have a responsibility to protect their children's information, right? So with the internet today, a lot is posted about children, birthdays, schools, where they go to. There is so much information that criminals can use to create the synthetic identities. And that is another way that financial institutions can prevent and stop this crime, is by analyzing, how robust is your fraud prevention mechanisms, and having the right controls and systems in place to deter this crime.
Thank you for that, Ruth. That was very helpful. What I've done also is added the LSEG risk intelligence paper. It takes an industry combating the rise of child identity theft for people that are asking for more information. We'll come back to you at the end for some questions that you might have. But now I'd like to introduce us to Bhaskar Mishra, who is UNICEF's lead on CRVS, so Civil Registration Vital Statistics. He is the identity focal point for the whole of the organisation, and he'll be speaking to us about what are the rights of children in terms of their identity. Thanks. Over to you, Bhaskar.
Can you hear me, Mia?
Yep, perfectly.
So thank you, Mia and colleagues, for the webinar, a very topical one. And thank you, Renata, for sharing a story, a very powerful one. So child identity theft is far more common than most realize and far less discussed and documented. It thrives on systemic gaps in digital exposure. Children's identifiers such as social security numbers, unique identifier numbers are highly valuable because they are clean, unused, and unmonitored for years, making them easy for fraudsters to exploit. As Ruth mentioned, theft often begins close to home, at times involving parents, relatives, or foster caregivers, and escalates through weak oversight in late or delayed birth registration processes and systems that are not connected to one another. From a practitioner's perspective, let me raise 3 systemic issues and gaps relating to birth registration and legal identity that can be exploited for child identity theft. First, weak CRBS systems and policy blind spots in CRBS fuel child identity theft, and it's time to act. Let me start with some numbers. Every single day, 362,000 babies are born worldwide. Yet, 101,000 remain unregistered, and another 44,000 are registered without receiving a birth certificate. This means millions of children begin life without proof of legal identity. Among children under 5, 150 million have never been registered, and 55 million lack a birth certificate. These gaps create a dangerous vacuum. Children without legal identity are at high risk of identity theft, leaving them vulnerable to stolen or fabricated credentials with irreversible lifelong consequences. Among the 500 million children under 5 registered between 2019 and 2024, the majority were registered after the legally permissible window, often beyond 1 year, triggering provisions for late and delayed registration. These processes are complex and costly, requiring witnesses, additional documentations, and in many countries, judicial resolutions. In Francophone countries, court orders become mandatory immediately upon the legal registration window's expiration, whereas in other countries, they apply only to delayed registration cases. The costs associated with these court orders are often exorbitant. For example, in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, you will have to pay anything between 80 to 100 US dollars to get a court order. And this does not include fines and certificate fees. Parents or applicants frequently need to visit the main civil registration offices and court multiple times, significantly increasing indirect costs. The situation is further exploited by unauthorized intermediaries, adding an extra financial burden on families. Recently, I was in Syria, and we observed instances of doctors being bribed to issue birth notifications for children born outside the country to bypass the late and delayed registration processes. And they were as old as 2, 3, 4, and 5. Several of you would know children born to foreign fighters were registered with grandfathers, uncles, and other male members as fathers with obvious consequences. Beyond procedural and financial hardship, late and delayed registration poses a significant security risk. In my 17 years of working in this area, more than 90% of credential alterations occurred in late or delayed registration cases, making this the single most significant vulnerability to identity fraud. So what is the solution? The solution is register every child at birth, and this should be non-negotiable. Registration at birth means register immediately after birth or within the legally permissible window. Article 7 of the CRC underscores this obligation, stating that every child should be registered immediately after birth. And registration at birth provides the strongest and most secure credentials because the process occurs at the place of birth or through immediate notification to civil registration systems, ensuring accuracy and timeliness. It also enables the issuance of unique identification numbers at the point of registration, allowing real-time updates to population registers and national ID systems, a critical step for digital governance and service delivery. Importantly, registration at birth is free, and the first copy of birth certificate is provided at no cost. In countries where birth registration is integrated with maternity and immunization services, or where civil registration offices are co-located with health facilities, indirect costs such as travel and time are virtually zero. Registering at birth is therefore a protective measure against exploitation and credential compromise, ensuring every child begins life with a secure and verifiable identity. Second, why CRBS ID integration is critical to secure a single source of truth and prevent child identity theft. When we talk about a single source of truth, we mean one authoritative record of an individual's identity, which should be accurate, consistent, and recognized across all systems. The UN Legal Identity Agenda defines legal identity through 5 essential characteristics: name, date of birth, place of birth, sex, and parents' names. These should be established at birth registration and retired at death registration. So what is needed? The Health CRBS ID pathway. To secure identity from birth and maintain a single source of truth, integration must begin at birth. Health facilities should capture the necessary birth details needed to uniquely identify an event and transmit data to civil registration for immediate notification, declaration, and registration. During routine health interactions, collect parents' national identification numbers upfront. Don't wait until baby's birth registration. Once validated, CR offices register the birth and issue a unique identification number linked to a parent's national ID, preferably the mother. This registration data, along with UINs, flow into population register and connect seamlessly with education, social protection, and national ID systems. At the appropriate age, the child's national ID is issued after biometric capture, creating a secure pathway to all essential services. And it entails 3 advantages. Collect information once, use everywhere. To eliminate duplication, track changes, and maintain a verifiable trail to strengthen accountability, and move information, not people, to reduce barriers and costs. However, there are several constraints that undermine CRBS ID integration, and key ones are fragmented data standards, no harmonized protocols across health, CRBS, education, social protection, ID systems, absence of individual level data. Health systems, for example, DHIS2, rely on aggregate reporting, not person level records. Education and social protection systems face similar gaps, making cross-sector linkages weak. Uneven digitalization, they focus on sector-specific digitalization efforts, urban-centric efforts, leaving rural and semi-urban areas behind. Then you have logistical challenges in Africa and South Asia that exacerbate exclusion. There are systemic flaws and redundancies involving multiple visits, manual processes. Ignoring birth registration during NID campaigns, they often overlook birth registration data and depend on other sources. And this is very important because this is what I am seeing across countries in Latin America, Africa, South Asia. Necessary birth registration information can also be gathered during these campaigns with credentials verified through birth registration systems. Benin provides an excellent example of such a collaborative strategy. Without this, the risk of inconsistent records leading to serious consequences for clients. Then you have issues of low uptake of birth registration rates and lack of linkage to identity systems. In many low and middle income countries, the rate of death registration is low, with children's death records being particularly poor. When deaths are not linked to ID systems, records of the deceased remain active, creating ghost records that can be misused and often lead to impersonation and identity theft. This issue is especially serious in case of a child death, as the potential for misuse is longer and more frequent. In Syria, when a child dies, their birth registration identity is often transferred to a subsequent child to avoid the complicated and costly procedures. These practices can make such children appear older by the number of years equal to the age gap between them and their older siblings. This situation can hinder efforts to prevent child marriage, child labor, and protection of other rights. So what is the ultimate consequence? Every gap, whether in standards, data, or access, creates vulnerabilities in legal identity systems. These flaws not only block access to services, but open doors to identity theft and fraud, compromising credentials. Even countries such as India and Pakistan, with mature ID systems, lag in terms of CRBS ID integration. Third and final point, Mia, I'll take just maybe one more minute. Biometrics are not a substitute for biographic information. I'm reaching this point at this platform. The growing trend of relying on self-reported data for ID registration, as we are seeing in multiple countries, including Ethiopia, and without linking it to birth registration, especially for children, is deeply concerning. Birth registration is the only process that establishes legally verified credentials at the start of life. Biometrics are a powerful tool for authentication, but they cannot replace biographic information such as name, date of birth, and parentage. For a secure, trusted identity system, biographic and biometric data must work together to ensure accuracy, legal validity, and life cycle integrity. Recently, I reviewed a guidance note on birth registration for Francophone countries from a very well-reputed organization I'm not going to name, and I was aghast to see the suggestion that biometric data replace judicial resolutions, utterly ignoring the fact that judicial resolutions are meant to ensure correct biographic details. In conclusion, what we have explored today is only the tip of the iceberg, but this is a good start. So Mia, we are one team and we look forward to collaborate more. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Bhaskar. You've clearly showed us the many ways that a child's identity is at risk, especially if they aren't registered at birth and when it's not integrated in that way. And we look forward, I'm sure I can speak on behalf of LSG Risk Intelligence, to continue to work with UNICEF to make sure that this issue of children's financial abuse is attacked and responded to. But now I'd like to give the floor to Darren McCormack, who is from the US Department of Homeland Security Investigations. He's the Deputy Assistant Director with many, many years of experience, especially as he leads the El Dorado group. Over to you, Darren, to explain what does DHS do, what can they offer, and what lessons can you give to other countries as well? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mia. Thank you, panelists, and thank you for the participants for having me to be a part of this really meaningful conversation about an issue that does not get nearly as much attention as it deserves. For brief context, I'm a Deputy Special Agent in charge with Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, which is the largest criminal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security. We have offices all over the United States. We have a global footprint. We have approximately 100 offices in about 50 countries. And the role of those offices is to act as liaison for multilateral international cooperation and information sharing where that host country sits. My current role, excuse me, as deputy, I oversee the El Dorado Task Force. The El Dorado Task Force here in New York, it's based in New York. It is home base for the largest financial crimes and anti-money laundering task force in the US. Arguably, it's in the world, but certainly known around the world as the most significant, most successful money laundering task force. Excuse me. The overall mission of HSI is straightforward. It's national security and public safety. Now, within that, we have about 50 investigative programs, some of which specifically focus on exploitation, whether it's human exploitation and/or financial exploitation. And this is where identity theft and child identity theft are a focus, as well as human trafficking, human smuggling, child exploitation, things of that nature, and then the financial component of those related crimes. So in the El Dorado Task Force, our mission is essentially to follow the money of these predicate offenses as it relates to victim-based crimes or exploitive crimes such as identity theft or fraud. Our approach is a victim-centered approach. What that means is the investigation starts with the victim to understand how the victim was exploited or violated, and we work those cases backwards with our domestic partners, as well as public and private sector engagements like this one, and then with our international components for information sharing and law enforcement process. So what we do as it relates to victim assistance or victim-centric is, as a national security and public safety priority and criminal investigators, our job essentially is to arrest, prosecute, seize assets, and forfeit money. Where the victim-centered crimes occur, part of that sort of life cycle is to repatriate the money back to the victims. So the victim-centered approach is repatriating money, funds that are lost as a result of the predicate offense, but also, as Renata and Ruth pointed out, how do we provide victim assistance to those who have lost? It's not only financial. There is an emotional component. There's a psychological component. Parts of your life, logistically, credit, are devastated from this. So we'll work with our partners here in the U.S. and abroad, certainly from not-for-profits, who will offer things like accounting services or credit repair or counseling services through the Red Cross or other NGOs who can provide assistance to the victims of these crimes. And then, the simple, I think, as far as an awareness campaign for HSI and for the viewers or the attendees who may be listening to this, I think the main takeaway for me would be that law enforcement, certainly federal law enforcement, is a partner. And I make myself and my agency available for webinars like this and for campaigns like this to bring awareness to what we do as an agency, but also bring awareness to the resources that we have, and also to explain and give some context to how we run our investigations. So again, with El Dorado, our focus is the financial component of any crime or criminality. In the U.S., statistics are roughly 23 million Americans are affected by some sort of identity theft, and that's a huge number. In 2024, U.S. financial loss to identity theft was somewhere around $13 billion. So the problem is pervasive. What we see from a law enforcement perspective is that for 23 million Americans, and that doesn't encompass worldwide, obviously. And Renata pointed out a lot of these issues, certainly with child identity theft, go underreported or unreported. So this problem is a lot larger than we actually know. Part of the issue is because we don't know who has been exploited or who is a victim, certainly as a child, until they become 17, 18, 19 years old and they start applying for credit. And now the problem is uncovered. So the numbers are larger than what we're seeing is reported. So again, our job is to follow that money. And I think what we see is some of the criminality, certainly with identity theft, is not, it's almost like microtransactions where, excuse me, an individual, the perpetrator, can steal or manufacture either a synthetic identity or a real identity and build up some credit to either liquidate assets and take money, borrow from credit and not pay back, which leaves the victim with devastated credit, or there'll be a good credit, a good customer paying their credit, but getting items for free that are resellable on the black market. So whatever they resell the items for, it could be diapers, it could be baby formula, it could be energy drinks. Certain people who are related to other criminal networks in any neighborhood or any part of the world, they're reselling these products for 100% profit. On the other side of that, we'll see criminals and criminal networks who will build up the credit lines for a victim, whether it's a synthetic identity or a real identity or a child. And what they're called bust out schemes. So essentially, they will make purchases, they will make timely payments, they will extend their credit, credit agencies and banks will offer greater lines of credit to the tune of $50, $100, $100,000 plus. And once that credit line is built up, they'll start writing checks or taking withdrawals on those credit accounts, and then they disappear. So they'll walk away with, significant amounts of money, again, leaving a ton of a wake of destruction, financial and otherwise, for the victims. So our job is to identify the perpetrators, to expand those investigations, to identify other criminal networks and or the organizations that support the criminality, and then identify the source of the funds or identify the stolen funds, and in the best case scenario, repatriate those funds to the victims.
Thank you for that, Darren. That was excellent. Like, I'm learning when I listen to Renata, Ruth, and Darren speak. It's another world for us, working from children's rights perspective, and I think it's a really good way to build synergies between the child's rights organisations and people that are listening today and will continue to listen, but also from the financial institutions and the law enforcement. Like you said, we have to partner together to tackle this issue. I see only one question. If anybody else listening has other questions, there's one question for you, Bhaskar, from Raju. He's based in Nepal, and he's talking about UNICEF and UN agencies have to play a vital role for the identity rights of children, especially to make the state party implement these rights. And he says that Article 7 of the convention is not respected by countries. What's your opinion on this? So Bhaskar, did you want to answer that? And then otherwise, if anybody else has any questions?
Shall I?
Yes.
Yeah. So now this is a very valid question, and we have been engaging with countries as well as CRC committee members. Mia, very frequently we engage with them. So the idea is how to have stronger and effective implementation of Article 7. I led a joint mission, WHO, UNICEF, UNFPA joint mission to Nepal way back in January 2023, and came across a lot of challenges on the ground. So I completely agree with him. But then our approach, we follow a two-pronged approach. We work directly with more than 80 countries. And then we also liaise with CRC committee members. The idea is that every newborn should be registered at birth. But having said that, this requires a lot of efforts, because countries are still in the mode of clearing backlog every few years. They are not very keen to invest more in setting up systems. So if you don't have a system to register every newborn, you will never have the stock. And if you don't have the stock, you will never have the flow. So what will happen every 2-3 years, you will end up clearing backlog, and that would mean that late and delayed registration provisions, the same thing that I described in my presentation. From UNICEF perspective, we have shifted from backlog clearance to system building for newborns, and even within that, now we are paying more attention to registration at birth or within the legally permissible window. If you look at the 2024 updates, the UNICEF global estimates on birth registration, there are 5 calls to action. And the first call to action is about timely birth registration. So this is the way forward, but I agree, even in our private conversation with CRC committee members, we keep on requesting them, hey, it's time you add more teeth, just making a recommendation doesn't make much headway on the ground. We are working, but still we have some distance to cover. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bhaskar. And Renata, I see your hands raised.
Yes.
You also saw this question. There's a question about, is child identity theft crimes more prevalent in some areas of the world than others? I don't know if you have an answer.
Yes, I do. And then I'll also give the mic to Darren to answer a bit more on this one. But I would like to add a little bit the first question regarding articles. So UN Convention of the Rights of Children, you have Article 7 saying that every child needs to be registered at birth, but then you have Article 8. And what Article 8 basically states is that the state parties, they need to preserve the child's identity, and where the child is legally deprived, state parties shall provide appropriate assistance and protection. What I would like to say, like giving the voice of the victim, is that in all honesty and with all due respect, the UN is doing an amazing job in terms of the rights of birth registration. However, the enforcement of, once the child has that right, what is the state's responsibility when that identity is misused, is stolen, and illegal debt is done in the name of the child? I think that this is a extremely important piece that is missing in terms of the UN's role in giving recommendation to state parties, because Brazil is a signatory, is also a member of the United Nations. The US is also a signatory, and I can tell you that this is not being implemented in Brazil, in other countries, when it comes to identity theft. And I can tell you right now the reason: because there is money involved, because creditors want to be paid, and they are extremely unwilling to say, this is a child identity, you have a right to a clean identity. Of course it wasn't you. Here is a credit. They are unable to do that because someone needs to pay the bill. Like, I'm just talking in very simple English, because that is the truth, and that's what I keep hearing from the victims. And I get it, because I work also in the financial industry and fighting financial crime. Once you do that, then every single adult will use a child's identity because, oh, when 18, it's going to be written off. So you need to have measures in place. So I would just like to add that I totally agree that Article 7 needs to be better enforced, but Article 8, as a victim of child identity theft, I think is like that missing piece that is so necessary that we start looking at that. Moving to the next question, if there is prevalence in other countries, I think that there is, but I can tell you that there is lack of data. Like, all the data that we were able to find is from the United States, because there is some data related to child identity theft. There is nothing in Brazil, for example, because it's not considered child identity theft, what was done to me. But with this group that I have now, we did an independent research, which will publish our social media this week, of like lawsuit cases in Brazil in children's name, and we found 35,000 cases that are still open. That is not even counting the ones that were closed or the historical ones. So there is lack of data in a lot of countries, but I do believe that that happens a lot. We just don't have the data to see the prevalence. But maybe, Darren, I don't know if you can add here in terms of prevalence of this crime.
Yeah, thank you, Renata, and I agree, absolutely. I think one of, I don't know if it's the largest challenge, but one of the bigger challenges is rule of law. And so, based on the criminality from country to country, that's going to have an impact on what criminals and bad actors can get away with. That's number one. Number two, corruption, depending on where you are in the world, and Renata kind of touched on it, because creditors want money. That's not necessarily corruption, but if there is a financial interest, excuse me, in something to be gained, corruption does become a part of that. And in certain less developed countries throughout the world, that's a vulnerability. Technology, encryption, access to technology and encryption, and access to certain types of technology, that also lends to exploiting a country's or citizens of certain countries' vulnerability. Excuse me. And I think lastly, someone from country A doesn't need to live or be a citizen of country B to send people or recruit people to that lesser developed country or more vulnerable country or more vulnerable citizen base or would-be victim base to exploit, said country or said victims. So it really is a global issue. And depending on where you are in the world and what those vulnerabilities are, these organizations, the bad actors, they spend their time and energy, excuse me, trying to identify ways to exploit people and take their money. So there's always a willingness, and there's always a way to do that.
Thanks for that, Darren. And I think you're right that there are always people willing to exploit gaps where they can make some extra quick money. And Renata, I think you're absolutely right that the Committee on the Rights of the Child has to work more on Article 8. Already Article 7, they already have to do lots of work on Article 7 because you've already got over 200 million children without a birth certificate. But I've added in the chat this Article 8 that you mentioned, especially this Article 8 subsection 2, which talks about where a child is illegally deprived of some or all of elements of his or her identity. And this is what we're talking about here, is if financial abuse, we're depriving children of their identity. I think it's really telling that it's the state's obligation is to speedily re-establish the child's identity. And there are no states in the world that I'm aware of that's doing much to re-establish, let alone speedily doing this. So there's a lot of opportunities for states to work on this. And we will be meeting with the Committee on the Rights of the Child next year. And you would be welcome to come and meet them as well, because I'm sure that the committee haven't, I know that they don't know about this issue as well as we've been describing it today. But we've got 9 minutes left and I don't see any other questions. But what I'd like to do is to give each speaker maybe 1 or 2 minutes to give a closing word. Like if there was one thing you want everybody to remember from this webinar, what would it be, Renata? What would be your message?
I think the main thing that I would like you to know is that this is one issue that leads to a lifelong time of suffering. And more importantly, it can lead you to criminality because you're not accepted in the financial world, in the in the lawful organizations. You're not accepted as yourself. Your money is taken from you. People can see that you have a history of debt. I remember one time I went to the bank and the teller told me, how do you have such a bad credit at 18 years old? What did you do? Like, I did nothing, right? That's the thing. But the way that you start your life is the legal, lawful organizations looking at you as this person doesn't deserve anything. Look at how bad their credit is. Actually, a victim in the United States told me exactly that. The organizations will look at her like she was nothing. So she couldn't rent a place by herself. She couldn't have a account. It was really difficult to get. So I think is also an issue that can lead people to criminality. It can lead women, and I heard this from many victims, to stay in abusive relationships because they become extremely codependent in terms of the use of their identity. And the same happened to men. I heard from men as well. So I think is like a key issue. And that's the whole thing about Article 8. That's like just a very basic human right to have the right to your identity. So if you don't have that, it can lead to a lifelong time of suffering.
Thank you for that, Renata. Over to you, Ruth. What would be your one final message on this topic?
I think it's time for the financial industry to stop ignoring that this is a huge problem and do something about it. And there are ways to prevent and combat that. There are measures in place, like we have mentioned, there's technology out there for encryption, multi-factor authentication, ID verification, age verification, transaction monitoring. There are very different patterns to what an adult would have, in terms of spending patterns. than a child. So it's not a rocket science, really. There are measures that we can put in place to detect this kind of financial abuse. And we have a responsibility because we're talking about vulnerable individuals. The financial industry has turned, their eyes towards elderly exploitation, which is an amazing win already because they are a vulnerable population. But there is a much lesser focus on financial exploitation of children. So we hope that through this webinar, we're able to raise awareness and that, the financial industry can come to part and do something about this evil that is destroying children and adults' future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I hope also that the financial institutions get together and put some more resources and energy on this topic. I know that there are so many issues to address, but this one affects so many with such big ramifications. It's an important one that they prioritize. Over to you, Bhaskar. What do you think would be something what would be your message for people trying to tackle this issue of child identity theft?
So Mia, before I give my takeaway, there is one update. Early next year, UNICEF, as part of your legal identity agenda, we are going to start CRBS ID podcasts. And we are planning to bring the Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Amina Mohammed, and a couple of CRC committee members. So I will give you guys a heads up. And if you want to join, that would be an excellent opportunity to ask questions you can hear from the horse's mouth. Coming back to this system, I would say there is a need to have legally mandated, interoperable, and enforceable ID ecosystem. Okay. Even if one of these three pillars, is missing, nothing will work on the ground. Make everyone accountable right from the top to the civil registrar or the sub-registrar working on the ground, because the system is full of, I won't say, I'll hesitate in terms of using strong words like corruption and all, but, you get what I mean. And the second point is, as of now, the entire onus is on victims. I have been interacting with more than 45 countries, and I'm yet to see a country where the supply side actors has come forward and said, hey, all right, this is our responsibility and we will help you to sail through these challenges. Sorry. This victimization and then a whole lot of things. I tell you, the situation is so precarious if you go to the ground. I visited a couple of camps in Syria, widows camp. And I can tell you all these conversation around child rights, human rights, everything will fall flat. So I would say, and also we need to invest more in terms of developing systems, like monitorable systems, because I did some research this morning and I didn't find any data coming from LMICs, low and middle income country settings, including India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, like those kind of countries. So these are some critical gaps, but I'm very happy, Mia, that, this is a good start. And we need to continue with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaskar. I'm sure that having you at UNICEF, we will continue this agenda issue and we will make sure that we make steps forward. And over to you, Darren, to have the final word in terms of law enforcement. And it's very important, as you said, that El Dorado Group, you are the biggest in the world. And so you lead the world and the world is looking to you for guidance. What would be your final words?
Yeah, thank you for that. First, I'll speak on two fronts. One, as an individual, and I think to piggyback or really stress some things that Ruth mentioned is, as an individual, you want, awareness and education is fundamental. Securing your electronic devices, multi-factor authentication, password managers, really securing all of your information, ID theft prevention services, and then credit monitoring. So as an individual, you want to constantly be evaluating these things and checking, because you never know when you're going to be vulnerable. But also, like most things, all victims always think it's not going to be me. And it's always a reactive approach versus a proactive approach. I think from excuse me, an organizational perspective. Sorry. from an organizational perspective and from a law enforcement perspective, webinars like this and relationships and partnership are critical to both law enforcement, but I would say to the financial industry and not-for-profits as well. I think getting together and sharing information about emerging threats, best practices on combating these things, vital statistics about what sort of trends, how the trends are changing, or we as law enforcement, as partners, as financial institutions, are we doing a better job to mitigate some of the risks, to mitigate some of the problems? And if not, how do we do better? And I think these conversations, and for me and Homeland Security, excuse me, I'm sorry I sound like this, trying to bring awareness. I'm sorry. Bringing awareness to the public about law enforcement is not, law enforcement is your friend. Federal law enforcement is your friend. Certainly financial institutions, NGOs. There's a lot of resources that the federal government brings to the table, certainly as it relates to victim exploited crimes. So the more I can get out as a representative for HSI to engage with the public, to bring this sort of awareness and make people aware, as other forms of criminality come about, people know, oh, HSI, this is in their lane. They also do cyber. They also do human trafficking and human smuggling. So it's just constant education and partnership.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you to our speakers today. Thank you for sharing your years and years of experience on this topic, especially to you, Renata, for being so vocal and brave for the thousands and probably millions across the world that have been subjected to this financial abuse, and which leads to many other abuses, like you said, mental health, also well-being and development. We also thank the participants that joined today. Thank you for your interest. We will be in touch. We will be recording, this webinar has been recorded. We will share that. We will disseminate that. We will also be looking forward to doing further work on this in 2026. And so we will keep you updated. So until then, we thank you and stay safe and have a good end of year. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Mia. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.